I just finished another grueling 10-hour shift at the factory when I got the call about the cabin. A coworker, Jim, had mentioned it months ago during a break, saying he had a family place up in the woods near a town called Redvale, about a 4-hour drive from where we worked in Ohio. The cabin, according to him, was rustic but had the basics: electricity, running water, and solitude. At the time, it sounded like the kind of escape I needed. I worked 6 days a week on the assembly line, and the constant clatter of machinery was eating away at my nerves. I'd been saving up my vacation days for something like this. When Jim finally offered to let me use the cabin for a week, I jumped on the opportunity without hesitation. I didn't tell anyone else where I was going, partly because I wanted the time alone and partly because I didn't have many people who would care to know. I packed my old pickup with essentials: canned food, bottled water, my toolbox, and a hunting knife that had been collecting dust in my garage. The drive to Redvale was uneventful, a long stretch of interstate that eventually gave way to winding back roads surrounded by dense woods. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The town was tiny, little more than a gas station, a diner, and a general store. I stopped at the gas station to fill up and grab a few extra supplies before heading deeper into the forest where the cabin was located. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. It felt like no one had driven on it in years. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. It looked just like Jim had described: a small, one-story structure with a tin roof and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The first night was uneventful. I set up my things, checked the water and electricity. Both worked, though the lights flickered occasionally, and made a simple dinner. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant hum of machines at the factory. I fell asleep early, lulled by the sound of the wind in the trees. The second day, I explored the surrounding woods. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I found a narrow trail that wound through the trees and followed it for a couple of hours until it looped back toward the cabin. I noticed a few odd things along the way: a rusted-out car frame half buried in the underbrush, a collection of old, empty beer cans arranged in a circle, and what looked like the remains of a campfire. It felt strange but not threatening, so I shrugged it off. That evening, as I was sitting on the porch with a beer, I thought I heard something in the woods. It was faint, almost like a distant whisper, but it stopped as soon as I turned my head. I chalked it up to animals and went inside. The third day, things started to feel off. I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin, too large to be mine and too fresh to have been there before. They led around the back of the cabin but disappeared into the trees. I felt uneasy but told myself it was probably from a hunter or a hiker passing through. Still, I kept the knife on me for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, faint rustling outside the window, and once what sounded like a low growl. I stayed in bed, gripping the knife until dawn. On the fourth day, I decided to check the trail again, this time carrying the knife and a flashlight. I didn't get far before I found something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a tree was a dead animal, maybe a rabbit or a fox. It was hard to tell because it had been mutilated. The cuts were clean, too clean to be from another animal. Someone had done this with a blade. I turned back to the cabin immediately. My instincts told me to leave, but it was already late, and I didn't want to drive those roads in the dark. I locked all the doors and windows and kept every light in the cabin on that night. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, clutching the knife so hard my hand ached. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth. Then came the sound of the doorknob rattling. Whoever was outside didn't knock or call out. They just tried the knob over and over like they were testing it. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away and everything went silent. I didn't sleep at all that night. The first light, I packed my things and threw them in the truck. I was about to leave when I noticed something carved into the wooden door of the cabin, for deep, straight cuts like someone had dragged a knife across it. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the gas station in Redvale. The attendant gave me a strange look when I told him where I'd been. "That old place," he said. "Nobody's used it in years." I didn't respond. I just paid for my gas and left. When I got back home, I tried to convince myself it was just a random hiker or some bored local messing around. But late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps on the porch and the sound of the doorknob rattling. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, sure I've heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my window. I pulled the truck up the old dirt road, gravel crunching under the tires as I approached the cabin. It was deep in the Ouachita National Forest, far from any trailheads or campgrounds. This cabin, built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, had been abandoned for decades. Its location wasn't marked on maps anymore. Only the most senior rangers knew about it, and even then, most preferred to leave it off their patrol routes. But tonight, I didn't have that luxury. It was October of 1998, and the park had seen its fair share of vandalism lately. Graffiti on trail signs, smashed benches, trash left scattered in otherwise pristine areas. Last week, some hikers had reported seeing a group of teenagers heading into the woods near the old cabin with flashlights and beer. It was my job to make sure they hadn't decided to use it as their party spot. If they had, I'd file a report and leave a citation. Easy enough. I parked the truck about half a mile down the trail and killed the engine. It was better not to drive all the way up to the cabin. The sound might spook anyone inside. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a dull orange glow in its wake. I locked the truck and started walking. The trail to the cabin was overgrown, barely recognizable as a path. It wound through dense pine and oak, with the occasional sharp drop where erosion had taken its toll. My boots crunched over dead leaves and fallen branches as I moved steadily uphill. The silence out here was oppressive. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. As I approached the cabin, I slowed down. My flashlight beam swept the ground ahead, searching for footprints or any signs of recent activity. The cabin came into view slowly, its shape emerging from the shadows like a ghost from the past. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wooden walls were blackened with age and rot. The single window on the front was boarded up, though one of the boards hung loose, swinging slightly in the faint breeze. I paused a few yards away and listened. Still nothing. No voices, no music, no clinking beer bottles. Maybe I'd gotten lucky, and the kids hadn't made it this far. Or maybe they were inside, keeping quiet. The door was ajar. Not wide open, but just enough to make me uneasy. I stepped closer, keeping the flashlight low, and nudged it with my boot. Creaked open, revealing the interior of the cabin. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp wood and mildew mixed with something metallic, like rust. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, revealing a broken table, a couple of overturned chairs, and piles of debris scattered across the floor. There were no beer cans, no sleeping bags, no signs of a party. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the doorway to a corner of the cabin where the floorboards had been pulled up. Kneeling down, I could see where someone had recently disturbed the dirt underneath. There was a shovel leaning against the wall, caked with fresh soil. My stomach tightened. I radioed back to the station, letting them know I'd found signs of recent activity but no individuals. They told me to document everything and proceed cautiously. I clipped the radio back to my belt and took out my notebook. As I stood there jotting down notes, I heard it. A faint rustling noise coming from behind the cabin. I froze, flashlight pointed at the open doorway. It came again, louder this time, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I stepped outside, sweeping the flashlight in wide arcs. The beam caught movement near the tree line, but whatever it was disappeared before I could get a good look. I called out, announcing myself as a park ranger, but there was no response. I should have gone back to the truck and called for backup. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I circled around the cabin, keeping the flashlight low. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped downward into a shallow ravine. That's where I saw it. A second hole, freshly dug, about 3 feet deep. Beside it was a pile of dirt and a plastic tarp stained with dark streaks. My flashlight trembled as I crouched down to get a closer look. The tarp reeked of decay. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the radio. Before I could say anything, a sound cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but the beam caught nothing. The sound came again, closer this time. My instincts kicked in and I ran. I scrambled up the slope, my boots slipping on the loose dirt, and bolted back toward the trail. I don't know how I made it back to the truck without falling, but I did. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I reversed down the narrow trail, the headlights swept across the cabin. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the window, a dark figure watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the ranger station. I filed my report, leaving out the growling noise and the figure in the window. Who would believe me? The sheriff's department sent a team out the next morning. They found the tarp and the remains inside, human remains. The site was declared a crime scene, and the cabin was officially condemned. I never went back to that part of the forest. I transferred to a different park the following year. Sometimes I still dream about that cabin, about the footprints in the dirt and the sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. The official investigation never turned up any suspects. The case remains unsolved, but deep down I know someone or something is still out there. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched as I drove away, leaving that dark corner of the forest behind forever. It was the summer of 2013 when my cousin Ryan called me about a new project he was working on. Ryan was always the smartest guy I knew, a biologist with a knack for isolating himself in remote places for months to conduct research. This time, he had rented a cabin deep in the woods of Montana, far from civilization, to study the behavior of a rare species of insect. He said the place was perfect. No distractions, pure isolation, and plenty of wilderness. I hadn't seen him in years, and the invitation to join him sounded intriguing. At the time, I was between jobs and figured a little adventure might do me some good. He didn't need help with the research, he was clear about that. But he thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet, maybe even help him out with some of the heavy lifting around the cabin. When I arrived, the cabin was as remote as he'd described. It was a simple wooden structure, weathered and worn, with a tin roof that creaked in the wind. There was no electricity or running water, just a wood-burning stove, a hand pump for water, and a couple of kerosene lamps. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely broke through the canopy. Ryan met me outside, looking thinner than I remembered. He was in his early 30s, like me, but the long hours in the field had given him a wiry, almost gaunt appearance. The cabin was surrounded by his equipment. Large metal cases filled with tools, sample containers, and a weather station he'd rigged up himself. Nearby, a dirt path led deeper into the forest, marked by his boots and wheelbarrow tracks. Inside, the cabin was cramped but functional. The main room served as a lab and living space. One corner had a small cot and a pile of blankets, while the rest of the room was dominated by microscopes, jars of preserved insects, and notebooks filled with scribbled data. There was an unsettling smell, earthy and chemical, that I couldn't quite place. "This is where I live now," Ryan had said with a half smile when I first stepped inside. I couldn't tell if he loved it or if the isolation was getting to him. Either way, he seemed happy to have company. The first few days were uneventful. Ryan spent his time collecting samples and documenting his findings, while I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was beautiful but intimidating. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or distant bird calls. Ryan's work consumed him. He'd disappear for hours into the woods with his nets and jars, only to return with a manic energy, excited about some new discovery. I tried to make myself useful by chopping firewood, cooking simple meals, and helping him organize his equipment. At night, we'd sit by the stove, the only light coming from the flickering flames and the glow of his kerosene lamp as he pored over his notes. It wasn't long before I noticed how paranoid he'd become. He double-checked the locks on the cabin door every night, even though we were miles from the nearest town. He kept his rifle within arm's reach, though he never explained why. Once, I saw him staring out the window, his face pale, as if he'd heard something I hadn't. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer, just shook his head and went back to his work. I chalked it up to stress. One afternoon, while Ryan was out in the field, I decided to explore a bit farther than usual. I followed the dirt path behind the cabin, which wound deeper into the forest. After about an hour of walking, I came across a small clearing. In the center was a strange structure, a crude wooden frame, almost like a hunting blind, but covered in moss and vines. Inside, I found scattered animal bones, arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize. The air felt colder there, and I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I hurried back to the cabin and told Ryan about it. He seemed uninterested, barely looking up from his microscope. "Probably an old hunting site," he said, dismissing it, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt. The next day, I went back to the clearing, but the structure was gone. The clearing itself looked different, as if it had never been there. I searched for hours, retracing my steps, but found nothing. When I mentioned it to Ryan, he gave me a strange look and told me to stay closer to the cabin. It was a week later when things took a turn. Ryan had been acting increasingly erratic, muttering to himself and barely sleeping. That night, he was pacing the cabin, checking and rechecking his notes. He said he'd made a breakthrough but wouldn't tell me what it was. Around midnight, we heard a noise outside, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Ryan froze, his face drained of color. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to stay quiet. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of leaves and snapping branches. Ryan turned off the lamp, plunging us into darkness. We sat in silence, listening. The noise circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was stalking us. My heart was pounding. I could barely breathe. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. Ryan stayed by the window, rifle in hand, until dawn. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Ryan finally opened up. He admitted that he'd found something unusual in the forest, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the insects he'd been studying. He discovered strange markings on the trees, like symbols carved into the bark, and heard noises at night that didn't match any wildlife he was familiar with. He showed me one of his samples, a jar containing a small insect with translucent wings. It looked ordinary at first, but under the microscope, it was different. The wings had intricate patterns that looked almost man-made, like tiny, precise engravings. Ryan believed it was connected to the strange occurrences, but he couldn't prove it. That evening, I noticed the same markings he'd described carved into the trees around the cabin. They were faint but deliberate, like someone or something had been leaving them as a warning. On our last night at the cabin, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, more aggressive. Something slammed against the side of the cabin, shaking the walls. Ryan fired his rifle into the darkness, but it didn't stop. Whatever it was trying to get in. We barricaded the door with furniture and huddled in the corner, waiting for the assault to end. Eventually, the noise stopped, but we didn't dare move until morning. The first light, we packed up and left. Ryan refused to speak about what had happened, and I didn't press him. We never saw what had attacked the cabin, but the damage was real. Deep gouges in the wood, like claw marks, and strange footprints in the dirt outside. Ryan never returned to the cabin, and neither did I. He published his research but left out any mention of the strange events. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the sounds in the dark, or the markings on the trees. Years later, I read about disappearances in that part of the forest. Hikers and hunters who ventured too far off the trails, never to be seen again. The articles mentioned similar carvings found near the sites. I don't know what we encountered out there, but I've never been back to the woods since, and I never will. I had always been drawn to the idea of exploring untouched wilderness. So when an opportunity came up to visit the Amazon rainforest in South America, I didn't hesitate. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 32 at the time, restless and eager for adventure. I booked a 2-week stay at a remote cabin deep in the jungle, a place advertised as immersed in nature and perfect for disconnecting from the modern world. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was located hours away from the nearest town. After flying into a small airport in northern Brazil, I met a guide who drove me to the edge of the rainforest. From there, we took a longboat down a winding river for several hours until we reached the cabin. It wasn't much, just a wooden structure with a tin roof, perched on stilts to protect it from flooding during the rainy season. There was no electricity, just a gas stove, an oil lantern, and a bed covered with a mosquito net. It felt isolated in the best way possible. The guide, a wiry man who seemed used to this environment, gave me a quick rundown of the basics: how to use the gas stove, where the freshwater tank was, and what to do if I encountered dangerous animals. He also pointed out the small path behind the cabin that led deeper into the jungle. "Stay close to the cabin," he said, before leaving me with a quick wave. The riverboat disappeared around a bend, and I was alone. For the first few days, the solitude was everything I'd hoped for. The jungle was alive with sounds: the high-pitched chirping of insects, the calls of distant birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves as something unseen moved through the underbrush. I spent my mornings hiking along the path behind the cabin, careful not to stray too far. The afternoons were spent sitting on the small porch, reading or simply listening to the cacophony of the forest. At night, the darkness was absolute. The only light came from the lantern inside the cabin and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the dense canopy. The jungle felt different at night, more oppressive, as if it were watching me. Still, I felt safe in the cabin, its walls providing a thin but reassuring barrier between me and whatever was out there. On the 4th day, I decided to venture farther along the path than I had before. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but it was clear enough to follow. I marked trees with small scratches using my pocket knife, just in case I needed to find my way back. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. The jungle had gone quiet. The constant hum of insects and the chatter of birds had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it, a clearing up ahead with what looked like a makeshift campsite in the center. There was a tarp strung between two trees, a few rusted pots and pans scattered on the ground, and a tattered backpack leaning against a log. It looked as though someone had been living here, but not recently. The place had an abandoned feel to it, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The campsite didn't seem dangerous, but there was something about it that set me on edge. The backpack was zipped halfway open, and I could see the corner of a notebook sticking out. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out. The pages were damp and stained, but I could still make out some of the writing. It was in Portuguese, a language I didn't understand well, but certain words stood out: perigo, danger, desaparecido, missing, and ajuda, help. I flipped through the notebook, but the rest of the pages were either blank or too damaged to read. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what had happened here, but it was clear that whoever had written those words had been in trouble. I decided it was best to head back to the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence of the jungle persisted, and every so often, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and closed the shutters, something I hadn't bothered to do before. That night, I slept fitfully, waking up several times to the sound of branches snapping outside. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but the thought of that abandoned campsite and the notebook kept creeping into my mind. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and slightly smaller than mine. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting in knots. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. Over the next few days, the sense of unease grew. I stopped hiking the trail and stayed close to the cabin, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I started noticing other signs, too. Small items in the cabin weren't where I had left them, and the freshwater tank seemed to empty faster than it should have. Once, I found the gas stove turned on, even though I was sure I hadn't used it that day. On the 7th day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. The guide was supposed to pick me up at the end of the 2 weeks, but I wasn't sure I could make it that long. I packed my bag and started walking along the riverbank, hoping to flag down a passing boat. But as I walked, I realized I wasn't alone. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, keeping pace. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps did the same. When I turned around, there was no one there, just the dense jungle, silent and impenetrable. I returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, my nerves frayed. I locked the door and barricaded it with a chair, then sat in the corner with a knife in my hand. The jungle outside was alive with noise again, but it didn't comfort me. Every sound felt like it was coming closer. Around midnight, I heard it, the creak of the porch steps. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was outside. The doorknob rattled, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. After a long pause, there was a soft tapping on the wall, followed by a voice. A low, guttural sound that didn't form any words. I stayed awake all night, clutching the knife and staring at the door. The noises stopped eventually, but I didn't relax until the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters. When the guide arrived 2 days later, I practically ran to the boat. He asked if everything had been okay, and I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we sped away down the river, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall and thin, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to the Amazon. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. All I know is that something or someone was out there watching me, and whoever they were, they wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. I don't know why my dad's friend even owned a cabin in the first place. He wasn't the outdoorsy type. I'd only met him a couple of times, but I remembered him as this loud, city-dwelling kind of guy. He worked in sales or something, always dressed in suits and talking too fast, like he was late for something important. But one day, out of nowhere, my dad asked if I wanted to go with him to check out this cabin in the woods that his friend, Mark, had bought years ago but hardly ever used. At the time, I was 21 and still living at home. It was summer 2013, and I had no job, no college classes, and no plans. Spending a weekend in some remote place sounded better than sitting around the house. So, I agreed, even though I didn't know much about the place or why Mark had even bought it if he never went. We drove up early one Saturday morning. The cabin was tucked away in a forest in northern Michigan, about a 4-hour drive from where we lived. The trip there was uneventful, but the closer we got, the more isolated it felt. The paved roads turned into gravel, then dirt. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the sun, and the only signs of civilization were the occasional rundown mailbox or faded, "No trespassing" sign nailed to a tree. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it didn't look like much. It was a one-story place with peeling paint, a sagging roof, and weeds creeping up around the foundation. It wasn't terrible, but it definitely hadn't been taken care of. The windows were grimy, and the whole building had this abandoned vibe, like it had been sitting there forgotten for years. My dad unlocked the door with a key Mark had mailed him. The inside was just as neglected as the outside: dusty furniture, cobwebs in the corners, and a musty smell that reminded me of old basements. There was no electricity, no running water, just a couple of old kerosene lamps and a wood stove for heat. Mark had apparently told my dad to make himself at home and check the place out, maybe see what needed fixing. My dad's plan was to clean up a bit, stay the night, and head back the next morning. I wasn't thrilled about spending the night in such a rundown place, but I didn't say anything. We spent the day tidying up. My dad focused on the main living area while I explored the rest of the cabin. There wasn't much to see, just a small kitchen, a bathroom with no working plumbing, and 2 bedrooms with bare mattresses. One of the bedrooms had a closet with some old clothes and hunting gear that probably belonged to Mark, but everything was coated in a layer of dust. Behind the cabin was a small shed. It was locked with a heavy padlock, and my dad didn't have the key. He shrugged it off, saying Mark had probably just stored tools or junk in there. As the sun started to set, the forest around us grew eerily quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in the city at night. This was an unnatural stillness, like everything, birds, insects, even the wind, had just stopped. The air felt heavy, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark across the ground. We built a small fire in the fire pit out back and sat there for a while, eating sandwiches we'd brought from home. The silence was getting to me, but my dad didn't seem to notice. After a while, he went back inside to get ready for bed, leaving me alone by the fire. I stayed out there for a bit longer, staring into the flames. That's when I first noticed it, a faint rustling sound coming from the woods. First, I thought it was just an animal, but then I realized it wasn't moving like an animal would. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost like footsteps. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The beam of light only reached so far, and beyond that was just darkness. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My dad was already in one of the bedrooms, snoring loudly. I decided to sleep in the main living area on the old couch. It wasn't comfortable, but I didn't want to be alone in one of the bedrooms. The night was long and restless. I kept hearing noises, scratching at the walls, faint thuds on the porch, even what sounded like whispering. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a loud banging noise. It was still dark outside, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. Then I realized it was coming from the shed. I froze, my heart pounding. The banging was loud and rhythmic, like someone or something was trapped inside and trying to get out. I thought about waking my dad, but something stopped me. I didn't want to panic him, not yet. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the back window. The shed was barely visible in the faint moonlight, but I could see the padlock was still in place. Whatever was making the noise wasn't getting out, at least not yet. The banging stopped abruptly, leaving the night eerily quiet again. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching the shed, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I went back to the couch and stayed there until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I told my dad what I'd heard. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or the wood settling. I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue. I just wanted to leave. We packed up our stuff and were about to head out when my dad decided to take one last look around. He walked to the shed, examining the lock. That's when he noticed something strange. Scratch marks on the wooden door, deep and jagged, like they'd been made by claws. My dad didn't say anything. He just looked at me, then back at the shed. We got in the car and left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what was in that shed. Maybe it was just some animal, but those scratches didn't look like anything a bear or a raccoon could make. Whatever it was, I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out. It was the summer of 2019 when my sister, Lila, and I decided to spend a weekend at a cabin in the woods. We'd rented it online, wanting to get away from the city noise for a couple of days. The cabin was tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It seemed perfect, isolated, surrounded by trees, and far from everything. It was a simple wooden structure, more rustic than luxurious, but it had a charm we both liked. The weather forecast had mentioned rain, but we weren't worried. A little rain didn't bother us, and the idea of sitting by the cabin's fireplace with a hot cup of coffee sounded perfect. We packed light, some food, extra clothes, and a flashlight just in case. Neither of us thought much about safety. We arrived in the early afternoon. The drive up had been uneventful, though the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was a bit rough. The cabin itself sat on a slight hill, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. There was no cell service, but we had expected that. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Inside, the cabin was cozy but basic. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and 2 tiny bedrooms. Everything looked clean, though a bit worn, as if the cabin had been around for decades. A stack of wood was piled neatly by the fireplace, and there was an old lantern on the kitchen counter. The windows were large, letting in plenty of natural light, but as the clouds began to gather, the inside grew dimmer. By late afternoon, the rain started, just as the forecast had said. At first, it was a gentle drizzle, the kind that made everything outside glisten. Lila and I sat by the window, watching the rain fall and talking about random things. She had brought a book, and I had a journal I liked to scribble in. The atmosphere was peaceful, and for a while I felt completely at ease. But as the evening approached, the rain grew heavier. By the time it got dark, it was pouring. The sound of the rain against the roof and windows was almost deafening, and occasional bursts of wind made the cabin creak. We lit the fireplace and a couple of candles since the cabin didn't have electricity. The flickering light made the shadows dance on the walls, and I tried not to let it bother me. After dinner, we settled into the living area. Lila was stretched out on the couch with her book, and I was on the floor, jotting down random thoughts in my journal. Outside, the rain continued to pound, and the wind howled through the trees. It was the kind of night where the world felt small, as if nothing existed beyond the cabin walls. Around 9, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it was there. A sharp, quick noise, like something scraping against the wood. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. I glanced at Lila, but she didn't seem to notice. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. A distinct scraping like metal against wood. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to alarm Lila, so I stayed quiet and listened. The noise came again, then stopped. Probably just the wind, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up, pretending to stretch, and walked over to the window. The rain blurred the glass, making it hard to see anything outside. All I could make out were the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I sat back down, trying to push the thought away, but my mind kept circling back to the sound. A part of me wanted to check outside, but the idea of stepping into the rain and darkness was too unsettling. I told myself that it was nothing. A tree branch, maybe, or some loose piece of the cabin scraping in the wind. But the sound came again, this time from a different direction. It was coming from the front porch now. It was subtle, almost like the creak of someone stepping on the wooden planks. My heart started to race. Lila finally noticed my unease and looked up from her book. "What is it?" she asked, her tone casual, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. I shrugged, not wanting to scare her. "I thought I heard something outside," I said, keeping my voice even. She sat up, closing her book. We both stayed quiet for a moment, listening. The rain drowned out most sounds, but I thought I could hear faint movements outside. A soft shuffling, like footsteps. I decided to check the front door, more to reassure myself than anything else. Grabbing the flashlight, I walked to the door and unlocked it. The wind pushed it open slightly as I peered outside. The porch was empty, the rain pouring down in sheets beyond it. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees and rain. I closed the door and locked it again, feeling a bit silly for being so jumpy. "Nothing out there," I told Lila, trying to sound confident. She nodded, but I could tell she was a little on edge too. We went back to sitting by the fire, but the cozy feeling from earlier was gone. The cabin felt different now, less like a safe retreat and more like a vulnerable spot in the middle of nowhere. The sounds didn't stop. Over the next hour, they grew more frequent and harder to ignore. Scraping, creaking, and the occasional soft thud. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, as if something or someone was moving outside. By midnight, the rain had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind was relentless, shaking the windows and rattling the roof. Lila suggested we go to bed, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the living room. I felt exposed, like whatever was out there could get to us if we let our guard down. I decided to check the windows one last time. Moving slowly, I went from one to the next, peering out into the storm. First, I saw nothing, just rain and darkness. But when I got to the kitchen window, my breath caught. There was something out there, a shape just barely visible at the edge of the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. And then it moved. It stepped forward, into the faint light spilling from the cabin. It was a man. He was soaking wet, his clothes clinging to him, but he didn't seem to care about the rain. He was standing completely still, staring at the cabin. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Call for help? But there was no cell service, and I wasn't about to open the door. Lila must have seen the look on my face because she came over, her eyes wide. I pointed to the window and she looked out. She gasped, stepping back. We turned off the lights, hoping he wouldn't see us. The fire still cast a faint glow, but it wasn't enough to give away our position. We huddled together, trying to stay quiet. For what felt like hours, we sat there, listening. The man didn't knock or call out. He didn't try to get in. He just stayed outside, circling the cabin. We could hear his footsteps on the porch, the creak of the wood under his weight. At some point, the noises stopped. We didn't know if he had left or if he was waiting for us to come out. Neither of us dared to move. The storm finally began to die down in the early hours of the morning. The rain lessened, and the wind became a soft breeze. But we stayed awake, too afraid to sleep. When the sun came up, we cautiously stepped outside. There was no sign of the man, but we found muddy footprints all around the cabin. They led from the woods to the porch, then around the cabin multiple times before disappearing back into the trees. We didn't stay to investigate. We packed up our things and left as quickly as we could. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing on the road behind us. We never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way he stood there in the rain, staring at us. It was like he was waiting for something I didn't want to find out. It was the dead of winter in 2013, and I was spending the weekend alone at a remote cabin my family had owned for decades. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any town or cell signal. It wasn't some cozy, Instagram-worthy retreat. It was old and practical, built by my grandfather as a hunting lodge, with creaky floorboards, peeling paint, and a roof that looked like it wouldn't survive a heavy storm. But I liked the solitude. That Friday evening, the snow had turned to rain, unusual for this time of year. Thick clouds blocked out any hint of moonlight, leaving everything outside pitch black. I had arrived earlier that day, unloading firewood and supplies from my truck before the weather got worse. The cabin didn't have electricity, just an old propane lantern, a wood stove, and a few candles scattered around. It was primitive, but I'd grown up coming here, so it felt familiar. As night fell, the rain picked up, hammering against the roof and windows. I sat near the wood stove, trying to warm up after hauling firewood inside. The temperature had dropped quickly once the sun set, and even with the fire going, I could see my breath in the dimly lit room. I sipped some coffee from an old metal mug, listening to the rain and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. Felt peaceful in a way, isolated but safe. Around 9 p.m., I decided to step outside to grab more wood from the pile near the back of the cabin. I put on my heavy coat and boots, grabbed the flashlight, and braced myself for the cold. The rain was relentless, soaking through my hat and gloves almost immediately. My breath puffed out in clouds as I made my way to the woodpile, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The woods felt different at night, especially in this weather. The trees seemed taller, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. Every sound was amplified, the rain hitting the leaves, the wind whistling through the trees, and something else. I stopped for a moment, holding my breath. It sounded like movement, distant but deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods. I swept the flashlight beam around but saw nothing, just the dense underbrush and the rain pouring down. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, grabbed an armful of wood, and hurried back inside. Once the door was shut, I felt better, the warmth of the fire driving away the chill from my soaked clothes. I settled back into my chair, letting the fire dry me off. I had a couple of old books with me, but I couldn't focus on reading. My mind kept drifting back to that sound in the woods. It wasn't unusual to hear animals out here. Deer, coyotes, even the occasional bear. But something about it felt off. Maybe it was just the weather or the fact that I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. By 11 p.m., the storm had worsened. The wind howled, shaking the cabin and sending a draft through every crack and crevice. I decided to head to bed, hoping the storm would ease up by morning. The bedroom was small, just a cot with a sleeping bag and a single window facing the woods. I left the lantern on the nightstand, its dim light casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I lay there, listening to the storm, I started to drift off. Then I heard it again, that sound. Movement closer this time, just outside the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear over the rain and wind. It wasn't an animal. It was heavier, deliberate, like someone walking. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. The rain distorted my view, but I could just make out a figure near the edge of the woods. It wasn't clear who or what it was, but they were standing still, facing the cabin. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen. My mind raced through possibilities. A hiker caught in the storm? A hunter who got lost? But why weren't they moving? Why weren't they knocking on the door for help? I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I debated my next move. Should I go outside and check? Stay inside and wait? Call for help? But my phone had no signal out here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The figure disappeared into the darkness. 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone. I felt a wave of relief, convincing myself that maybe it was just my imagination or a trick of the light. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat by the fire with my hunting knife in hand. Hours passed, the storm raging on, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in the chair. I woke to silence. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. The cabin felt eerily quiet. I stood up, my body stiff from the uncomfortable sleep, and decided to take a look outside. The ground was soaked, puddles forming in the ruts and low spots around the cabin. As I walked around, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the edge of the woods to the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. I could see the distinct tread of my boots, and these were different. Larger, barefoot, they circled the cabin, stopping by each window and the door before disappearing back into the woods. A cold dread settled over me as I realized whoever had been out there hadn't been lost or seeking help. They'd been watching me. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear, loaded the truck, and got out of there. I haven't been back since. Every winter, when the nights get long and the wind howls through the trees, I think about that night, about the figure in the rain, about those footprints circling the cabin. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting,